Hello and welcome to MG305 Innovation and Technology Management Week 3. First of all, I owe you all an apology. I've been slacking in week 3, and then I got distracted by other work engagements in week 4, and that's why it's taken so long to make a video on week 3. I am truly sorry. Usually these videos take me about 2 hours to prepare. I think at least in first week it took me 2 hours. In second week it took me 1 hour. It was a rush job and it wasn't quite up to par to the quality that I feel you students deserve. This video took me 8 hours to prepare because I was trying to get the slides all fancy. We will go back to the usual 2 hour standard, I believe, next week for week 4, or rather I will record the week 4 video and then I hope to continue with week 5 and Mariana Mazzucato's proposals after reading week. However, for this week, instead of treating Silicon Valley and China's attempts at replicating Silicon Valley, I thought it would be better because, again, I do not want to talk to you about things that I personally do not know that much about. I thought it would be better to walk you through my own essay and moreover my essay writing process for MG305 so that perhaps you can learn from my experiences and also mistakes. Now, I will preempt this with saying the essay got a very high mark, I think 78 or something. Like, I was very happy with it. Nonetheless, I feel like I could have done a better job. Every time I reread it, I'm like, this is nice, but there's still things I want to refine. And so for me, this is also an opportunity to go over it one more time, which is especially important now that I am presenting ideas that I first formulated in this essay on the weekend at an Imperial Genetics conference. Now, let's get started. On the essay writing advice. This is more general. Now the slides look genetical, but the first 4 points I want to make apply to any essay you are going to write for innovation and technology management. Again, this isn't necessarily official advice, but rather what I as a student found to be a good way to approach it. I also realize the deadline for submitting your essay proposal has already passed as of yesterday, the 2nd of November, as far as I understood. But if it is the same way it worked last year, and I should have probably asked Jonathan or Dimitris about this, then you can still write about something that wasn't in your proposal, right? Your proposal does not lock you into writing what you're going to be writing about. Rather, it's just like they want to have a look to see if what you want to write about is something that makes sense to write about. And that brings me to not my first point, but actually my second point, which is stating the problem in a way that you can afterwards say, I found compelling evidence to support or to deny my claim, right? Like being analytical about this. And especially for Jonathan, who has a very quantitative approach to innovation and technology management. And that's what makes him such a good researcher. Although, in my own experience, some of the best papers I've read are not necessarily that rigorous, but they present very important ideas in more accessible ways. So it's a trade off between academic rigor, very important, so that you're not just saying something that's not founded in reality, but also accessibility and telling others informations in a way that they can understand without spending 50 hours, might be a bit much, but without spending a lot of time trying to understand what you're saying, and they don't have the industry jargon because every single academic discipline has its own jargon, as I'm sure you will know by now. Try and explain to your grandparents what disruptive innovation is, right? Okay, but my first advice that I would give you is write about something that interests you personally. Write about, and this goes a bit contrary to what Umberto Eco says when he gives advice on how to write a scientific dissertation. And you can view this essay as a mini dissertation, right? It's not 10,000 words, it's 2,000 to 5,000. But you can use a similar approach without having to invest quite as much time, perhaps. And Eco says the thing that writing a dissertation teaches you is critical thinking, which is a bit mimetic perhaps, but these skills that you learn, right? Becoming an expert in a certain small niche field is something that you can later on apply to whatever you want to. Apparently, Karl Marx wrote his scientific dissertation about some Greek philosophers, Seneca. Oh, Seneca's Roman, I think. But, anyways, some philosophers, very obscure, nothing to do with communism. But then he used those skills that he learned in writing his dissertation to apply to this other problem, right? And so, nonetheless, the reason why I say write something that interests you personally is because it's gonna get you engaged, it's gonna get you motivated. So, use this opportunity to learn about something that you are personally interested in. This is like the gift that you're given in this course. You have the freedom to decide to write on whatever you want about. And this is what I used because I was really interested in biotechnology, and I still very much am. And I think that's where I'll be going in the future. And that's why I took this essay. And I said, hey, let's learn more about this topic. Now, point two, find a problem to tackle. I was initially writing about genetics and genomics, which was my main focus in biotechnology at the time. And that was my essay proposal. And that was what got approved. And then as I was writing it, I just found too many good things about biotechnology as a whole. And I realized there's deeper rooted issues at play here that apply not only to genetics, but to the whole sector. And as you either have already learned or are going to get a glimpse of in the following weeks, innovation is not sequestered into individual small sectors. It's the whole societal system that we need to have a look at, right? But that doesn't mean you can't have a look at small sectors. And that is a very valid approach that will make you able to say more conclusive things than if you try to understand everything, right? Because then the way Jonathan puts it, you can't use, or rather, you can't differentiate between the essays and the papers and the information and the books that are actually relevant to what you're trying to say and everything else. And this is something that I perhaps didn't do quite as well. I like to, get ideas from different places and just pluck my own theory together. But things are defined by what they are, but also by what they aren't. And sometimes it's good to have a focused scope of what you're trying to get at. So I'm not good at this, but you can do better than me. And number three, assembling a library. Now, what this means is, and you've already done this a little bit, if you've written your proposal, you've sent them a few indicative articles, books, or even just magazine articles that tell them more or less in which direction you want to be writing on, right? You're showing them, in a way, you're showing Jonathan and maybe also Dimitris that there is literature to help you answer this problem. But what assembling a library is, for example, what I did every week. I just go have a look, LSE portal, and just type in like biotech and genomics and whatever, knowing how to use a search engine, and then just took a bunch of readings and just sent them to myself by email. And like the list kept going longer and longer of just a bunch of links directing me to different things to read, right? Like learn and read and digest all those ideas to be able to write your essay in time, right? As I say here, find relevant research and slowly grow your knowledge. And especially think about how the things you find connect to the frameworks and ideas presented in the course to be able to critically examine whether or not what those outside readings are saying is valid according to course theory, but maybe it's also course theory that is wrong, right? But being able to say that is great as well, and letting those different ideas play off against each other and maybe even fight each other a little bit, if you will. And something I haven't put down here apparently, but what I also wanted to say is start writing. Start writing because even if you don't know what you're writing about, right? And you don't have to start writing the introduction, start writing a passage, a paragraph somewhere. Because when you start writing, you'll realize that you don't have the information to say certain things, right? You want to say something, but you're lacking a satisfying source, or better yet, you want to know about something, but you haven't found any evidence for or against this state or this statement yet. So when you begin to write that way, it's like an iterative approach to writing the essay. Then you will find what you need to be looking for in terms of research, and then you can direct your research in that direction. Strange that I didn't put that down. But regardless, that's, oh yeah, I actually put it down here. If you can't state the problem, start writing. I think that's the approach I would take. And finally, let it simmer. And what I mean by this is imagine you're cooking a soup and you're trying to get all the flavors to percolate in it, right? You add the spices, you add the bay leaves. I'm getting a bit into Indian cuisine this year. It's quite delicious. And the sauces, right, the liquid like plays into itself more if after cooking it, you let it stay for an hour or two. Now, I'm not saying let it stay for too long, right? But right early so that you can come back with it with an objective mindset. Because the problem is when we write an essay, and I'm sure we've all done it at some point, right? The getting it done just by the deadline, which I actually did for this course, frankly, if I remember correctly. I had like a week to go and I had all the information to be able to write my essay. And I started and I sat down and I said, well, I might as well just write it all down, which is a valid approach to take, I would assume. But then I just kept finding too many new good ideas that I wanted to incorporate because I hadn't started writing up until that point. I was just reading, thinking that then I would just use everything that I'd read. But I just kept finding too many good things. And so my essay focus shifted from genetics and genomics to biotech as a whole. It zoomed out when, in actual fact, usually what you want to do is zoom in. But inevitably, sometimes you will have to zoom out. And that's why starting small is also not a bad idea. Okay, this concludes my essay advice. And I will now be moving on to my own essay. Now, for those of you who are not too interested in biotechnology, please feel free. This was the main point of the video, to pause, to stop. And if you are curious about what my essay looked like, and it will also teach you a little bit about how to construct your own essay, but I would say it's not necessarily what Jonathan would be looking for in a good essay. And somehow it still got good marks, but don't necessarily use it as a blueprint to construct your own essay. It's just one of the ways in which an essay can go. Nonetheless, if you really want to look at what Jonathan's looking for, then look at the sample essays discussing whether or not Tesla is disruptive. I think that's more along your alley. All right. The question of Biotech, system failures and dynamic solutions. Now, what does this mean? Come and find out with me in due time. The introduction and mission statement is supposed to give people an idea of what they'll be reading about, right? In this case, but it's also stating what it sets out to do. This essay critically examines the anatomy of biotech management models. I got a bit carried away with using biological metaphors. I think I have like a section somewhere where I talk about neuronal pathways and user-producer interaction, but anyways, discussing salient examples to theorize a new improved model. So what I try to do with my essay is essentially, and you can see this further down below on this page as well, that the way we think about technology, especially modern technology, is very much rooted in this Silicon Valley mindset, right? Microprocessors, transistors. Those are the main studies we conducted in modern times. And so the way we think, for example, a startup should operate, if you look at Steve Blank's The Lean Startup, he says, or rather his mentor, Eric Rice, or maybe I'm mixing up the two. Maybe one's the mentor, the other is the rule of two, as they say in Star Wars. The way they put it, their advice for how to run a successful startup and their consumer-based approach is not valid for biotechnology or for human health. And the reason for that is that a lot of their methods center around product validation in the sense that they're not sure if there is a customer who wants this, right? So they know they can make this app that delivers food to your home directly, right? To give a very modern, common example. But they're not sure if people actually want this, right? By now, this has become a validated business model, but say 10, 15, 20 years ago, who knows? So, what their processes and agile project development and all those frameworks center around is customer validation and being able to make a lot of quick changes to learn a lot about what exactly customers want and being able to pivot quickly. But the problem with biotech is this is not like the issue we're trying to solve. We know people want a cure for a deadly disease. Like, you don't really have to, you can if you want to, but like if you ask 10 people who are afflicted with a disease that will kill them within the year, hey, do you want a cure? And would you be willing to pay, a reasonable amount, a few thousand? Then if they have the money, they will absolutely pay this, right? Medicine features inelastic demand, almost infinitely inelastic demand for severe things, which is also what makes it ripe for exploitation, but that's something for another point in time. The point I am making is that a lot, or at least several different studies, all conducted in the mid 2000s, all agree that what's holding biotech back is the way we think about business being conducted in this sector, right? There's not enough prudent business people to bring the breakthrough inventions that we get to the market. There's not enough funding as well to get those innovations into a product state that us consumers can buy. And so the reverse salient, if you think back to Hughes, the bottleneck in this whole process is innovation theory, the thing we're studying. That's my point. And this cannot stand. That's what I say in my mission statement. So this whole essay is an attempt to propose a new model with which to think about biotechnology. Whether or not I've succeeded, I'll let you be the own judge. Right, but I start out with a literature review because I need the readers to understand how drug development works, which is a far longer process than most product development cycles take. Because first you have a new molecule that is found, you have like a prospective drug, hey, maybe we can treat this. And then it takes a very long time to even get to clinical testing, right? First, you need to test it on mice, on monkeys, already like slightly contentious. And then if you pass this, right, if they don't show severe adverse effects, then you start testing in humans. And this also passes several regulatory hoops. And this is what pharma companies are good at, is passing those hoops. That's why they're still like milking this cash cow of um, new drugs, because they're the ones who have the talent and expertise and industry connections to get drugs through those very rigorous medical trials. But it's good that we have those trials, because we do not want medicine on the market that does nothing, which is, if people want to buy some miracle cure that they smear on their shoulders and it, I don't know, attracts pigeons to them. A very strange example, but let's go with this. And they believe in it. We have to protect the consumer, but they're not really drawing harm. They're just spending their money on something that doesn't do anything. That's bad, but that's one thing. If you let them buy something that is actively deleterious, and you have someone who drinks something thinking it's medicine and it's poison and it kills them, this is not something we should allow. And that's why we need strict and rigorous FDA approval trials. But that's also why it takes 20 years until a drug goes from invention to innovation. Right. So that's the drug delivery process. This is it from a firm perspective. And here you can see all the different sources of funding. So in the initial stage, in basic research, you have the National Institute of Health amongst other institutions, right? Basically the government and universities bringing it, giving us that base level research, that R&D, and then stepping to innovation and invention of a functional model, right? We understand how does this work and what would the product be looking like, but then you need to validate this. You need to actually step from idea to product. And there is no clear defined source of funding for this. You have like maybe the National Institute of Health funds it, maybe Bill Gates and Melinda Gates and other foundations fund it, maybe venture capital funds it. But there's like a lot of uncertainty about who is supposed to fund this third stage in the development model. And those are the two things that I need readers to understand preemptively before we can get into the discussion. All right. These two slides are actually remnants from an old presentation I held in which this is centered on the genomics market. It looks at Illumina and what kind of consumers they are providing. It's not that important. This is a bit more interesting because Illumina is in a oligopolistic market, one could say, and they have tremendous market power. And we can see here the Porter 5 forces analysis, which if you study management, you will be familiar with probably from HR, if you've taken it, then this shows a very low amount of competition in this sector. And I believe, if I recall correctly, what I said in my essay is that contrary to what Utterbeck and Abernathy say about the fluid phase development cycle, an industry analysis shows that there is very low competition, even though the industry is already quite advanced, right? Genomics has passed from the 80s, from Sanger sequencing to next generation sequencing. The products are basically commodified. I was discussing this with the head of the entrepreneurship um, incubator in Cambridge in Illumina. And what he said is that everyone's more or less providing the same product. There are differences in long read and short read sequencing. And there's one new, very interesting competitor in Oxford nanopore sequencing, which is a new way. This could be seen as truly either a radical or a disruptive innovation, depending on which framework you apply on this. Something that the old incumbents in the market can't take advantage of because of knowledge constraints and because of this being a patented or secret technology. But nonetheless, this is not in the fluid phase of development, right? This is not like trying to figure out what people want in terms of product. And once again, this is where the Silicon Valley mindset fails us because there is increased complexity. And so even though the industry is almost mature at this point, right, in gene sequencing, nonetheless, we still find that they're trying to change the products and not necessarily the process. But going back over this, I'm not so sure anymore if what I said was actually valid, right? And so ask yourself as well when you're, this is me, I suppose, as well. I love to argue. Ask yourself if you're actively arguing in a concise way against something, or if you're just shadow boxing, right? If you're saying that these authors espouse certain ideas, they said something and they never actually said it in that way. So they're just arguing against something that they didn't actually say, which is very bad scholarship. And I'm partially guilty of this. Right. How is biotech different? This comes from a paper from Pisano, a Harvard Business Review article. Can science be a business? Lessons from biotech. Gary Pisano is a consultant. He works a lot with biotech and pharma companies, but also in other sectors. You've read a paper by his by now, probably the what's it called? The Thies, Pisano, and Schuen 1997 paper on dynamic capabilities. And he is, I have found, someone whose papers are very pleasant to read, and I do recommend them. And some of them are more broadly technologically applicable. But what he says in this one is that there are three things that make the biotech sector different from other sectors. The first is the biological complexity inherent to the system, right? There's a difference between a car manufacturer saying, all right, I'm going to propose this model, and based on the design, they can already tell this is going to work or this is not going to work, right? Like engineers know, okay, if you put the wheels on backwards, then well, our car is not going to work. So we need to fix this. Human biology is a product of a long, 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 long time of incremental change. And it is rooted in such complexity that scientists still don't understand. We still cannot synthesize wood. Let that sink in. We're still at the very fringes, at the very base of what it means to understand. We're making very fast progress. Nonetheless, there is this uncertainty about whether or not your product is in the first place even going to work, right? There's a different kind of validation necessary to get it to work. The second point is long-term planning. So unlike traditional startups, as I already mentioned, biotech firms cannot pivot as easily because there are huge risks involved in developing a new drug. So if you have a single failure, you're gone, right? Your business is gone. And because of that, they can't learn from past mistakes and failures, which is a crucial part of being in a startup is failing. There's this whole culture of celebrating failure, or rather celebrating learning. But the problem is in biotech, you don't get away with failure. If you fail, you die. Um, and that's part of the reason why the sector is different. And the third one is sticky knowledge. And the way Pisano puts it is that a lot of the knowledge that is learned is tacit or intuitive, which, as you probably know by now, if Demetrius explained it as well to you as he did to my cohort last year, this knowledge in the system doesn't move from one place to another. My dad says it as riding a bike. You can't explain to someone what it's like to ride a bike and expect them to know how to ride one. You have to do it yourself. It's muscle memory. And furthermore, there are islands of knowledge, but no pooling, in the sense that there's industry experts who know a lot about a single domain, let's say neurogenetics, but they don't know what's going on outside of it, say light microscopy studies. I encountered this myself when, and that's why I raised this particular example, because I was in a talk at UCL last year about someone proposing a new Alzheimer treatment thing. So there's beta amyloids in your brain, and they leave a certain residue that clogs up the pores, and this causes, among other things, Alzheimer. And he proposed a model with which to stop the clogging in older patients when it is detected that their pores are clogging up. But he didn't know how to clear away the pores. Now, optogenetics, another new technology, who who the exact inventor is contentious, which is why I won't give a name now. But it's a very fascinating technology by which you encode genes to become light receptive, and then you shine infrared light on them or other kinds of light to make them either become active or inactive. And this can be used, according to MIT's physics department, to clear those amyloid residues in the brain. And if you couple those two solutions together, right, you might be able to have not necessarily a cure to all kinds of Alzheimer, but at least a pretty good approach on how to potentially tackle this problem. But the scientist was an expert on neurogenetics. He didn't know much about new developments in other fields. And this is the kind of issue that I mean. The solutions exist, but it's about piecing together the pieces of the puzzle. There's also patent trolls, or rather, the patenting system as a whole constraining the flow of knowledge. Now, Jonathan has ideas about patents that I think are valid, and I commented on this in my paper about how they incentivize innovation, right? There's also another huge important role patents play in that they put they make private knowledge public knowledge, because to file for a patent you have to explain in detail what exactly it is that you're patenting and how the technology works. So this moves into the public domain after a while. But while patents are active, consumers are being left to be exploited in a way, because once again you have infinitely inelastic demand in a lot of these places, and because of that, drug pricing, especially as you know in America, the medical system is a mess. And so I personally believe, and I did not have the time in my essay to do this, that the way our patent system works needs a fundamental rethink. But again, this is a story for another time, and we'll leave it at this for today. Right. This brings me to tech push and the integrated approach. Now, you're already familiar with the definition of tech push, I think, but I'll state it again just for completeness sake, and because maybe some of my friends are watching this and they may not be innovation scholars. So, tech push is what happens when a new technology, a groundbreaking technology, say, is found, but I think it can also be sustained, it can also be a small thing. And this propels the industry forward in the sense that people then use this technology. In the case of biotech, it would be finding a new molecule or finding that penicillin, hey, this kills bacteria. So let's make a product, right? Let's make antibiotics, which have over the past 50 years helped the average life expectancy of birth to rise by over 15 years, I believe, which is a staggering amount. So Tech Push is finding a new way to do things and letting that. So it's a lot less controlled, right? You just look for things and wow, this works. Let's make innovation. Demand pull is where the sector of biotech is slowly but surely moving towards, which is that you want to cure certain disease, so you run the numbers, like you look at different ways of how can we cure this, and then maybe after a long search, you find a way to cure it. But the reason why I bring this up is traditionally, if you recall, Chesbrough and Rosenblum in their 2002 article on Xerox propose this model, right? I feel like it's a very simple, intuitive model of just your business model has to account for both your own inputs and economic outputs. And it's all about like figuring out how to best commercialize your technology. Now, let me present to you what Kilji, I never know how to pronounce this name, Mroczowski and Bernstein in 2006 proposed in their biotech innovation model. A bit more complicated. But what they essentially are saying is that there needs to be an integrated approach, both tech push and tech pull working together, right? Market forces need to be considered, but also what is available in technology needs to be considered. And the dotted line here that you see below invention marks the pre-invention stages. So just like the groundwork innovation that we saw before in the other model being like stages 1 and maybe 2, and then the post-invention stages, and then like all the considerations surrounding what do we do with it and how do we work with this. And if you look at this, right, it's the creation of a patent from the invention leading to funding and financing, and the question of how to sell this new invention. And unfortunately, what happens a lot in the biotech sector, because once again, there's huge risks in finding a patent. So all organizational efforts are directed towards creating this information that's worth something. In a sense, the only output the biotech sector has for the most part is knowledge, which is radically different from a lot of other technological sectors in which you want either software or hardware. It's only knowledge. And then pharma companies buy this knowledge on the open market and use it. But that's unfortunate because pharma companies then don't invent anything themselves. It's the age old problem of startups want to scale and want to grow, but as you grow, you stop innovating and you only exploit. You're not generating any new value to society, so to say. You're only capturing it or extracting it, as Mazzucato would say. And that's very unfortunate. All right. This goes against the promise of what biotech could be, which is a nimbler alternative to the age-old pharma oligopolistic sector that makes the new inventions more accessible to all of us. So let me present you a case example, business models in action, Biogen Unchained, because what the business model I just showed you, amongst other things, or like this framework, what it shows you is that there's a different way. You don't have to sell off the patent you create. And Unchained is a funny way to name your paper. Unchained because most biotechnology companies are tethered to the pharma industry, and they're either gobbled up as a whole by giants like Pfizer and Merck and the other ones, or just the knowledge, the patent that they produce is bought. But in the case of Biogen, these are their headquarters. They, for the longest time, used to operate in this way until either it was in 1978 or they were founded in 1978, one of the two. They came up with Avonex, which is um, a way to treat multiple sclerosis. And after, like, as soon as they got FDA approval, Avonex was in stores in 48 hours everywhere. And the way they did this was they had a very fundamental, great understanding of the capabilities that they had internally and the ones they needed externally. And so they did what we would now call lean manufacturing, in that they outsourced all of the parts of the production process that they didn't want to do themselves. In particular, they singled out four different things, which I cannot currently recall. So I would ask you to ask me to send you my essay if you really want to have a look. Um, then please go ahead. But yeah, they produced their own drug in a far more accessible manner than previously. They just went ahead without having to think about, or rather, they had to think about manufacture a lot, but they didn't have to do it themselves. They found excellent business partners with whom they could together bring Avonex to the market without having to sell off their intellectual property to the pharma industry. So, an example of, or rather, why it's important in your essay to bring up examples like this, and this is something one of my smartest, or perhaps the smartest person I know has told me, is that, and this came up in conversation when we were discussing Mazzucato and why he thinks she is such a great economist, is that the frameworks you propose and the ideas you have need to be backed up by real world examples, right? Your theory, the most beautiful theory, can be destroyed by an ugly fact. And in a similar sense, if you're saying something, make sure you're not just theorizing it, make sure you can back it up with examples in the real world. Furthermore, frameworks have to tell us what common sense does not. Um, and what this means is that frameworks have to connect different players in the market. In this particular case, in biotech, they have to connect them in unobvious ways. All right. So, if a framework can help us to identify, I'm sorry, I'm just plugging in my charger. If a framework can help us identify potential business players in the market and people in the market that we weren't considering beforehand who we should get in on our production process, then that is a valuable framework. And yes, Biogen's seamless integration of the production process is an example of what could be, is the promise of the biotech that we could have rather than the one we do have right now. So we need to connect, or rather, the framework as it stands would need to connect competences, market demands, so what consumers want, right? We can't ignore what consumers want, and potential partners in meaningful ways and unobvious ways. Okay, moving on to my next point. Does anyone know who this charming individual on the right hand side is? Basically, always smiling, always saying he's quite happy, like a bumblebee. This, and I immediately answer because this is a recorded video, there's no audience participation. This is Eric von Hippel. He's a professor at, I believe, Stanford, not sure, who writes on open innovation. And he has written a book called Democratizing Innovation, which he has made available for free, and it's in the bowels of MG305. It's not even in the recommended readings, it's in like the additional readings if you're really interested. But I think if you're going to read any book for this course, this is the one I recommend because it's quite easy to read and it is, goddamn, it's excellent. But I'll talk more about his ideas for my week 4 video because that's, I believe, where he is hidden. Rather, what I would like to talk about are user-producer interactions. And this is a really obscure paper. I think it has like 10 or 15 citations that helped me tremendously in writing my essay. And this is not a publicly available paper, but rather I asked the writer, the author, Miss Morse or Dr. Morse, on academia.net, if I may please have a look at this essay because I am at this paper because I am writing an essay on this topic. And she sent it to me within a day or two. It's like, good luck with your essay and enjoy. And this is a secret that publishers of academic journals do not want you to know, is that they put their papers behind paywalls, but the researchers don't want them to be behind paywalls oftentimes. They want their ideas to be out there. It's like I am part of a generation that thinks that information should be free. And a lot of the researchers disagree with papers putting them behind paywalls, and it's just like they have to publish them, and that's how it works. But they're very happy to share them with you if you ask them. So don't be afraid in your library generation process to ask academic researchers whether you can have their papers and potentially even about ideas and questions regarding their papers, right? That's how we learn, not just by reading, but by asking questions. All right, user-producer interactions. There's the challenge in innovation of aligning user needs product features. Now, this disagrees a little bit with what I was saying earlier about how user needs are obvious and we don't need to think about them, right? So democratizing innovation is an idea that is useful in all processes of innovation, or almost all of them, I would say. However, it's a bit more difficult to apply to biotechnology. But there's still a point to it. There's still a very valid point, and this is what Morris and I'll talk about user producer interactions. So it's the user and the producer engaging in relationships beyond buying and selling, rather to the user inviting the producer inviting the user to the innovation roundtable, to the R&D lab, and saying, come work with us to figure out how to best make the product that suits your particular needs. And in functional genomics, Morse and her colleagues talk about two sides: medicine and um, genetically modified foods. And genetically modified foods lost that publicity war. I think they were shunned by society, but we're now seeing a resurgence with artificial meat. And so the challenge is ensuring that your consumers are with you on this. They're going to trust you more when they understand, right? It's the question, the comparison between knowing a fact and conceptually understanding how the whole thing works, right? Like you can buy an iPhone and you can use an iPhone without ever knowing how an iPhone works. But you're going to be a lot more on board with whether, like with privacy concerns, if you know exactly how an iPhone can track you and cannot track you. And then, so it's, you gain a lot of trust from your consumers. And I would say in medicine, and even in like non-life saving medicine, let's just say artificial food, is still quite important. It's important to let your consumers know that what you're producing is not using technology to drive down prices and like dump quality, but rather to make something that's healthier, right? Um, Right. And there's this idea of innovation as a dynamic rather than a linear process, which I quite like. So I included a GIF here to show you that, yeah, it bounces back and forth between users and producers. Like they're just passing the ball back and forth. And then there's the pivotal idea that I loved. This is like one of my favorite innovation theories, lead user identification. And I'm not sure if it was von Hippel or Lundvall, who comes up later in a different context of innovation systems, that first came up with this. Lead users are particular individuals who have really high stakes in you making this particular innovation, right? They're people who are ahead of the market in terms of using something. For example, for me, it would be I love listening to music, and I have a lot of opinions about what it's like to listen to music and how music should be accessible to me. And the reason why these are crucial and why these should be identified is because they are excellent at articulating what it's like to use a service, to use a product, and articulating user needs that users are going to have 6 months from now or earlier or later, but in the future, this is going to become important. And these users already know about this. But there's also the question of where can you find those lead users, right? Where can you find the people that love using your products and might potentially even be willing to pay something to become prototype testers, among other things? In medicine, lead users, I mean, it depends on the sector, but for example, they can be found in patient advocacy groups. There's people with rare diseases, and they have spokespeople for them who represent, say, the 50 people who have come together to discuss how their particular rare disease that's caused by a certain protein mutation affects them. And part of the reason why this is important is because, unlike with something that Google does, where they make the employees eat the dog sandwich, I think they term it, they make an engineer use the app they're designing, even though it is utter like it's terrible when they first start out, right? But that forces them to think about what is it like for the user to be using them. And I actually used one of my favorite papers of all time in philosophy, Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat, where he makes the case that we can imagine what it's like for us as people to be a bat. It's hanging from the ceiling, eating a lot of insects and seeing through echolocation, but we don't know what it's like for a bat to be a bat. And I like bats. Um, and similarly, a lot of doctors don't know what it's like to be a patient, especially for a rare disease, especially for something that not a lot of people go through. And that's why it's crucially important to identify those lead users. Right. Um, and if you can increase the trust of the people in your new innovation, then this gets you those crucial early adopters that will help you diffuse your innovation. Think about Rogers 1971. All right, we're reaching almost the end, I would say. And I wanted to discuss some more the islands of knowledge and what we might be able to do about it. Um, so, to reiterate the problem, this scientists know a lot about their particular field, don't know so much about stuff that's happening outside of it. Um, Kilji et al. Have this idea about necrotic alliances. So scientists engaging in partnerships, right? Biotech companies engaging in partnerships with other biotechs, either vertical or horizontal partnerships, and then finding out this is not what we needed. This is bad. We should get out of this. But it would be a huge PR hit if we did, right? They might lose funding, they might lose investors, and so they stay in a toxic relationship, even though it's not good for them. So seems a bit like a human problem in general, but I'm not quite sure why I put this on this slide because I fail to see now how this connects, but still an important point to note. Yes, solutions to the islands of knowledge problem. Crick's science states. So the Crick Institute conducts science states where two scientists in completely different disciplines just meet up for a coffee, or now I would suppose it's a socially distanced science state, but still pretty good. And they just discuss for an hour or two what their particular domains are and how they might be able to interact with one another. The Crick Institute is the largest biomedical institute in the UK, maybe even in the EU. Um, Very groundbreaking research happening there. And so it's not surprising that they adopted this policy of connecting things that wouldn't usually be connected. And if there is nothing too purposeful, though there usually is from the statements I've been reading by scientists who took part in these states, you only spent an hour or two and you got some coffee. And that's already quite nice. Interdisciplinary education. So this starts at a point before people are professionally trained and before they are strictly in the workforce. This needs to happen. We need people with interdisciplinary um, expertise. That is to say, people who might not be the absolute like pinnacle of knowledge in a particular field, but just people who know a lot about a lot of different things. And that's why we have things like PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics, right? Um, to teach people interdisciplinary knowledge in the social sciences. But we don't have this cross merge between social and science. And that's a shame. Um, there's some attempts. There's Berkeley has a biology and business bachelor, and to be honest, this is not surprising because that area has a lot of biotech startups. Um, Similarly, UCL has a bioscience entrepreneurship master degree that I'm currently in the process of applying to, or rather, will be applying to when they open up applications on the 9th of November. Um, and I think this is something that needs to happen more and more if we want to combat this issue of these vestiges of knowledge and these oceans of ignorance that surround it. Yeah. And then we also need better frameworks to identify interaction nodes. And that would bring me to Lundvall's ideas, which I assume you have not yet explored in your course, but we'll get to in some short time in the next couple of weeks. This systematic thinking of innovation at a national level, or perhaps in the future, even at a global level, of how should different places in the market and also in society interact with one another, right? Where are the best places where scientists and business people can meet to innovate together, amongst other things? Where are the best places where policymakers can learn from scientists how to best regulate their given field? Because right now, genetics is a mess in terms of regulation, and I'm slowly developing the idea that regulators are old, and because of that, they're a bit out of touch. Now, I would not want to be accused of ageism, and I love old people, but maybe we need fresh blood in politics who is better aware of how technology works. Right. That brings me to the issue we were trying to address before, this gap in the third step of the innovation pipeline. And fixing this pipeline, or at least an attempt at fixing this pipeline, requires a firm understanding of different systematic issues. It also requires innovation performance metrics, which I believe these are proposed by Kiliji, and unfortunately I forgot to put in the other metrics in the brackets of examples, but I should be able to explain it nonetheless. We need financial measures. These are the ones we already have, right? As we can see, market value, scale, revenue, profitability, market share. But we also need things to assess operational measures, innovation measures, and industry growth measures. So we need to understand not just how well is this company making profits, but also how much new value is being generated thanks to this company creating new knowledge or finding new knowledge for us, right? And then we can funnel our investments there. Now, Mariana Mazzucato, whose paper I unfortunately had not read before writing my essay, only read it afterwards, I believe. She has this idea about obviously the state as an entrepreneur, but also the fact that we currently cannot properly differentiate between risk that arises from bad management and risk that arises from inherently risky Knightian uncertainty. So, something that just because it's trying to adopt a radical innovation, and it's a bit of a long shot, but if it works, it's going to pay off to us rather than the other thing, which is just risky with no big payoff. We currently, given our financial system, do not know how to differentiate between those, and that's why there is too little investment in biotech, which pays out in a very long time, right? As we saw, it can take 20 years for an investment in biotech to pay off, and venture capital firms generally want payoff within the next 5 or maximum 10 years, and then they want to exit. Um, so we need patient capital, and Mariana Mazzucato would have provided an excellent component to the argument I was constructing, but I hadn't read it yet. And that's why, even if you fail, or I wouldn't say fail, but even if you can't find the time to read all the papers, discussing it with your friends who have read some of the other papers, and then maybe getting an idea of, damn, this is a paper I should read, can be really important, right? It's knowing what you don't know. All right. It also requires us to figure out who is supposed to be making the decisions in a biotech company. And something Kilji once again and his colleagues say is that a lot of the time scientists try to hold on too tight to control rather than what would be better is to give it on to business leaders. At the same time, as I heard in an Illumina podcast of last year, some scientists are forced to become entrepreneurs because business is not willing to pick up their ideas. So there's problems on both sides. There's also once again the question of who funds industrial R&D. As we discussed before, there is no clear source of funding. Maybe crowdfunding is something we should consider. But ultimately, this systematic underinvestment, I believe, is something that the entrepreneurial state is very apt at fixing. But this requires further political considerations and asking the populace if this is what they want to invest in. What should our business models look like? Do we want to continue with farmers' exploitative measures without actually creating any value in society themselves? There's new alternatives being discussed. There's new deals regarding CRISPR cures. This was by a science reporter, Miss Irvine, again, potentially Dr. Irvine, who comes up with the, or rather reports on a state in the United States agreeing preemptively to pay a fixed amount for the production of a drug for the next um, couple of years. I think it was 5 years. So they're guaranteeing their supply of this drug. And in return, they're guaranteeing payment to the biotech companies so they know there will be a market. But there's also a cap to how much they have to pay. So there's less risk, there's less payoff. But frankly, biotech has so much damn risk that they'll probably be happy to have to carry a bit less of that. There's also the question of, should we only be focusing on this one particular sector, or do we also want to include solutions that potentially arise from outside biotech? And at the conference I was at last year, which is the same conference that's happening next week, where I'll be giving my lecture, Foremost, a UK-based technology company, demonstrated their prototype and validated business model of using artificial intelligence to accelerate the drug development process. They have the tagline of drugging the undruggable, because they can go after drugs thanks to this technology that were previously thought to be incurable, or at least with our current technological standing, untreatable. And the way they do it is that they use AI to look at the particular molecules and figure out whether or not the reaction is going to cure the disease or not. And this can help identify which molecules we should be researching. So this very like first step of 6.5 years to finding something that you want to test can thus be shortened, I think, by about threefold, if I remember correctly, down to 2 years or so, which is a long time. 4 years is longer than our degree. Okay, so in conclusion, what have we learned? We need to think about user producer interactions. We need to have mission oriented funding to fix the funding crux in the middle section of biotech. We need to think about systematic linkages. So, connecting different islands of expertise with one another, building bridges to traverse these oceans of ignorance. We need to rethink the way we do finance, intellectual property, ethics, which I could not go into in my essay, similar with IP, design of drugs, and research to finally create the most societal value. If you've been watching until now, thank you very much. It means a lot to me that, you're disinterested in something I wrote and spent a lot of time on, and will probably continue to be spending a lot of time on in the future. I think my flatmate is waiting for me. I am preemptively celebrating my birthday with him, so I hope to see you soon. And until then, stay safe.